Hello, humans and the environment. I have a pretty short lecture for you today about a couple of pieces that I think you will enjoy very much. We are going to be talking about the shallow and the deep long-range ecology movement, a summary by Arne Naess, and Reinventing the Green Imagination by Anthony Weston, and we'll also be talking a little bit about your imagination. So to start with this piece by Naess about deep ecology, Naess starts out by contrasting deep ecology with the shallow ecology movement, which he characterizes as sort of mainstream and environmental movements that emphasize, as a lot of this class has emphasized, pollution and resource depletion, sort of the negative impacts of modern humans, and how we can achieve human affluence in the developed countries, how we can maintain our wealthy lifestyle in countries like ours, and reduce our negative impact by recognizing the harms that we've caused and trying to reduce them. So instead of this traditional picture, Naess proposes what he calls deep ecology. This idea, he characterizes this idea with 7 bullet points. So I'm going to move through each of those bullet points to try to give you a sense of what he's talking about in each one of these. It's a pretty short, accessible piece, I think. And then we'll talk about Weston also and how that relates. So the first bullet point here is what Naess calls a relational total field image. So instead of seeing ourselves sort of on top of the world, even when we see ourselves as polluters or destroyers, we're still sort of seeing ourselves in control of the world. Naess suggests the image of a net like this, a kind of net with each of these points all being interconnected to the others and all affecting the others. So if you pull on one knot in a net like this, it's going to affect every other knot in that web. And so he suggests that we see our role in the biosphere like this, that each of us is just one little knot, and we're connected through multiple relationships to everything around us, to the rest of the biosphere. And every organism really occupies an intersection of these strings. And the idea here is not just that we are connected, but that we are by definition connected. So it's intrinsic to who we are that we play the role that we do in this broader web of relationships among organisms in the biosphere. That's sort of the main overarching claim that reconfigures how we see ourselves and our relationship to the world around us. The second bullet point is what he calls biospherical egalitarianism. So egalitarianism is a kind of equality. And so the idea here is that everything in the biosphere has an equal claim to life. He talks about how this warrants a deep kind of veneration and respect for other life forms, understanding of other life forms, seeing the rest of life as intrinsically worthy of being alive and having an equal right to live and blossom in their own right, and respecting all of life really is what this amounts to, respecting it all equally and seeing ourselves as no more or less important than all the other living organisms that are around us that create that web of a whole. The third bullet point is about diversity and symbiosis. So diversity, this idea of lots of different life forms all being present, and symbiosis is working together, performing functions that enhance life for other organisms, and having those organisms perform functions that in turn enhance life for the rest of us. So diversity and symbiosis involves humans and others. He calls this the ability to coexist, to appreciate all that's around us and allow it to flourish and be able to cooperate in complex relationships. So being able to be mutually beneficial around a diverse array of organisms and work together in creating this intricate whole. The fourth bullet point is what he calls anti-class posture. So he is working against, and sees deep ecology as necessarily working against, the exploitation of people in positions of power of those who are not in power. Exploitation by people in positions of power of those who are not in positions of power. So we can look at the imbalance in power between people in developed and developing countries, and how people in developed world use vast majority of the resources, as we've already discussed, and they are dependent on the labor and exploitation of, that is, we are dependent on the labor and exploitation of people in developed countries to provide the goods that we consume. All that trash we create was made by somebody. And so he talks about how exploitation can actually reduce the potential, not just for those who are exploited, but for the exploiters themselves. So there's the egalitarianism among all life forms is also translated into a kind of egalitarianism among humans, because this world that we have now, where you have a small part of the global population using a vast amount of the resources and depending on the exploitation of others, is not consistent with the kind of vision that Naess has of a deep ecology that is the kind of interconnected web of living organisms that he demonstrated with that picture of the net. Number 5, we fight against pollution and resource depletion. So within the deep ecology movement, there's also a fight against these harms that humans are bringing, as with the shallow ecology movement. But the difference is that this is one among many different points. So that, remember, the shallow ecology movement was characterized in this piece as fighting against pollution and resource depletion, but the ultimate aim is the affluence of people in developing countries. It's the ability of people with lifestyles like ours to maintain these lifestyles. And instead of that picture, Naess is proposing this deeper picture of the kind of egalitarianism we've been talking about, and that puts pollution and resource depletion in its place as one, the reduction of pollution and resource depletion is one goal among many that we have. And so the stuff about the anti-class posturing and egalitarianism and seeing ourselves as interrelated and intrinsically interrelated, those all go hand in hand with viewing ourselves as destructive. So we are as much a part and a beneficial part in striving to function beneficially with the rest of the biosphere, as much as we are focused on the harms that we're causing and trying to reduce them. Okay, so that's why it says here, not at the cost of ignoring the other points, is that this holistic picture involves us as much as beneficial cooperators with the rest of life on Earth as we are attempting to reduce our harm. Those two goals go hand in hand, and all the other 6 bullet points that he's discussing. So number 6, focus on complexity and not complication. So the idea is that all of these interrelated webs are exceedingly complex, but they're a unity at the same time. They're integrated, and they work together in this holistic way, and we can perceive that integratedness, if I can use that word. So it's not just hopelessly complicated, like there's no sense to it. It very much makes sense as part of a unified structure and system, but it's still exceedingly complex, even though it's unified and integrated. So part of recognizing that complexity involves appreciating our own ignorance. He talks about less prognosis and more possibility. So the idea is less trying to predict what harms are likely to ensue if we keep up our current lifestyle, and more trying to reinvent other ways of being and other ways of living and other ways of being in the world. And he's advocating here, I like this phrase, exponential growth of skill and invention in new directions. So that in new directions is the key point here, and using our inventiveness to kind of steer things the way we want them to go, rather than just focusing on all the bad that's likely to come. And the last point here is a focus on local autonomy and decentralization. He talks about how vulnerable we are because we're sort of globally interconnected and surviving with a strong dependency on people very far away from us, and that inevitably we're going to have a more localized, decentralized economy because this is unsustainable, as we've said. So trying to shape that for ourselves proactively, and he talks about how that will reduce our vulnerability because one thing can happen in one part of the world and it's not going to cause everything to collapse. It will affect the people within that location, while other locales are still strong and vibrant, and can maintain that even in the face of hardships elsewhere on the globe. And it also reduces energy consumption because we're not, for example, sending strawberries halfway around the globe so that we can eat strawberries whenever we want them, right? We just have a localized economy. We produce the goods that we consume right where we consume them, and we don't put all of that energy into staying globally connected and moving goods all around the earth. All right, so that's sort of some of the highlights of Naess's piece. I want to move on now to Anthony Weston's piece, which I especially think you all will enjoy, so make sure you read this. I'm only going to touch on a few points because I think I really can't say it better than Anthony does. Anthony's a local philosopher. He lives in Durham and teaches at Elon University, and has some great stuff on creativity and imagining possibilities and using our imaginative capacities to change the world. So I encourage you to check him out. He's got a bunch of stuff. I just included a couple chapters of this book. So he starts out by noticing that we've witnessed spectacular change even within our lifetimes, and even really within the last few years, if you think how much the world has changed. I mean, we saw COVID shut down the school system for a year in some places, and so to think about humankind entering into a change that dramatic, I mean, none of us really saw coming what the ways that COVID would affect our lives, even though it's clear that there are pandemics predicted and more pandemics on the way. The particular ways in which we've had to adapt and change just in the last few years should really make it no question that change is possible. We can change dramatically and rapidly, and we're going to change dramatically and rapidly within our lifetimes. So it's really about harnessing those changes. He talks about city landscape as an example of something that was once just a vision, but then that humans actually created and maintain and build and rebuild. And even though they're environmentally disastrous, they are impressive feats of human skill and ingenuity. Weston talks about changing the endpoints of the scale. So when we think about how to better the world, how to stop pollution, we see pollution, again, the focus is on environmental destruction, pollution, resource depletion, and we see ourselves as trying to reduce emissions, trying to bring that to zero, as if that were the ultimate goal. But much like we heard from Naess, it's not just about reducing harm. It's really about imagining possibilities and inventing possibilities. And Weston talks about this as changing the endpoints of the scale, so that instead of striving for zero impact, we're actually striving for a positive impact. So what would that look like? And he gives lots of examples of how we can do that. So here's one. What if a truly smart house would not turn the lights off when you leave the room, but turn itself into compost? What then, right? So imagine that, everything we use goes directly back into the earth when we're done using it. And he's talking about radical, instead of just thinking about clean energy and smarter cars, he's really shifting the shifting the end point of the scale, but shifting our whole vision of what's possible. So a big emphasis here is focusing on systems and not components. Okay, so that's an example. If we're trying to just make greener cars, but leaving our transportation system basically intact, we're not going to get to where we need to be. So part of the reason we're stuck, I think, and stuck in our ability to imagine outside of what is sort of the focus of what's possible. One reason that's so hard is because when we focus on ways to make the world better, we usually can only pick one component and try to fix that component. But Weston says we have to change the whole system. And so here's another example, not green cars, but a world built for walking, like a world where we don't need cars in the first place. He talks about walkers' inns, if you could imagine, like maybe some of you have hiked the Appalachian Trail. They have these established sleeping places for hikers along the trail. Well, what if that was what the world was like? So you could walk anywhere and have a place to stay along the way. He talks about long, slow trips, sabbaticals for everyone. I need to pause for one moment. I just paused for a moment to check on my napping toddler, so let's get back here. All right, so we have to rethink whole systems and not just components of systems. And what we know as the way life works does not have to be the way life works. And the way life works currently is not going to be the way that it works forever. So yeah, when we think about the future and the changes that we want to see, we really have no constraints on what we can envision and what we can imagine because of the types of change that are coming our way. So, I mean, sabbaticals for everyone. What if it were normal to get a year off regularly in your work schedule, and to be able to take the time to walk great distances, to walk for a vacation that's weeks long, where you could see the country from a whole different perspective, if we had that kind of infrastructure that made that possible and worthwhile. Just some visioning that he's doing here. So that is the point of saying other worlds are possible. That's the title of this chapter. They are not simply this world with one factor varied. We can only conceive serious change once we remember that a system can and must be rethought and redesigned as a whole for when we're thinking about responding to our environmental crisis and how to make a world that is sustainable and that is worth living in. Okay, so some focal points of this chapter. Everything is connected. Again, that's the first bullet point from Naess, this idea that we're more like a web of interrelations than we are a person sort of standing on top of a mountain or something. A better metaphor is seeing all of life as part of this web. And changes synergize. So we talked about synergy already. When you change one part, one thing, then you have other changes that are exacerbated by that change, and that can be a positive feature of change because we can harness that synergy to maximize our impact and to create greater changes that transform and sort of snowball off one another. Constant transformation on all fronts at once. I mean, that's what we're witnessing. We're witnessing such radical change happening all around us. And he says the real challenge is to give it a new shape, to redirect its flow. So we're going to talk about this idea again when we read Octavia Butler towards later on in the semester, seeing ourselves as shapers of change. So it's kind of like a surfer rides the waves. We direct the surfboard where you want, but you're still given the shape of the ocean, and you can't change the ocean. So the idea is that we sort of insert our will where we can get the biggest output from our input, and take the changes that are coming our way and accept the changes that are coming away and give them a new direction and a new form. Then we have this chapter, Way Beyond Recycling. So talked a little bit about recycling in one of the earlier weeks of the semester, and so now we can take this like at least 25 steps further. So Weston defines stuff with a capital S as this sort of cheaply, widely manufactured stuff that we make just so much of, and that lasts a very short time, and that we go through and throw away. So he's talking not better managed stuff, not better recycling programs, but no stuff at all. So he talks about goods that are actually good. He gives the example of a pen that's an heirloom, right? That you just take out the ink when it's done and refill the ink, and you can use most of the rest of the pen. The same with laptops. I mean, so much of what we throw away is not necessary to throw away. So actually making stuff that we want to keep around, that gives us joy to keep around, and seeing the goods that we use as actually good in more respects than just to benefit us for a few hours. Even wonderful goods, right? So heirloom designs, things that you keep not out of duty but out of pleasure, even love. So he gives a lot of examples of those. The pen is just one, but other ways that we treasure heirlooms that are passed down from generation to generation. How could we make more of that a part of our everyday life and the everyday things that we need to live decent lives? He's talking about embrace and celebrate, main focuses of this chapter. And now I want to talk about your imagination a little bit, and I want to ask you to get out a piece of paper. So if you need to pause the video, do that right now. Get out a piece of paper and draw a smallish circle in the center of the page, and I'm going to give you the instructions on how to do this exercise, and then you're going to go off and do it by yourself. You won't need to watch the video to do it after you've got the instructions. But the first thing you should do is set a timer for 2 minutes and use that time to clear your mind, to get present to this task. Close your eyes and focus on your breathing, focus on the sounds that you hear. Try to get into the moment and try to release whatever stress or anxiety or troubles are on your mind. Take a few moments with a timer set to release some of that and come into the moment, be able to focus on what you're about to do. And then you should set a timer for 5 minutes and fill this circle with any ideas you have about nature, the world that you want to live in, the world that you envision us living in the future. Imagine that we've solved the crisis that we have before us, and that life is totally different now. I want you to spend some time jotting down ideas about what that would be like. What would you want there to be in that world? So fill this smaller inner circle with that for 5 full minutes. Try to come up with at least 25 ideas in those 5 minutes. Don't stop to evaluate any of your ideas. Just write down as much as you can. And once those 5 minutes have passed, pause again, take some breaths, take a moment to collect yourself, and then draw a second circle. And see if you can expand your thinking to fill that second circle as well, beyond the types of ideas that you wrote in the first circle. And again, set a timer for 5 minutes and do this exercise too. That is all I have for you. I hope you will really do this exercise and spend some time thinking, talking to other people. And this is just the beginning of the part of this course which really encourages thinking in a positive direction, in a new direction, and transformative thinking. And we'll stop focusing on the bad news, at least for a while. So I hope you have a great weekend. I hope you don't get too wet in the rain that's about to come, though by the time you're watching this, that will probably be behind us. And I will see you soon.